So we are continuing this week in our sacred gathering in the season of Lent in the second week. And looking at the traditional readings, I was struck again by an Old Testament passage. I suspect they are kind of working their way through the covenants, the way God has kind of shaped a story coming up until Jesus' time. And there's these reoccurring themes, of course, of these waiting, these reoccurring themes of these 40 days having to trust God. So we looked last week at Noah, just the messy story that is. And we will continue that this week, looking at the kind of next major covenant, that between Abram and Sarah and God, and the promise of a baby. But as I said, it's also kind of a messy story with very messy people in it, and I guess that's all God has to work with. So I think Lent overall has some strong waiting themes involved, of waiting on God, seeing what God is up to, of trusting, and I think that comes out very heavily in this story. So Abram himself is a fascinating figure. Again, he's a very flawed human being, and yet there are three different kind of world religions that all claim him as their founder. This is, of course, Judaism, and the Old Testament that he comes from, Christianity, which is was supposed to be the same religion as Judaism, but there was a parting of ways, and Islam. The three kind of monotheistic faiths all claim Abraham as a very important figure, though they have kind of different understandings of who he is. So I think on the positive side, Abram is called in the New Testament the father of faith, and I think there's a reason for that. Even at his own middle age, when he was fairly settled, he hears God's call to go to a foreign land, a place he doesn't know, that God is going to be there with him, that God has promises for him, and he trusts God. He goes. And then again, a couple chapters before what we'll be looking at, he is told by God, even though he's an old man at this point, he's told that he is going to both possess this land, that his descendants are someday going to possess it. And he doesn't currently have descendants. He can't have descendants. He doesn't have any children of his own. So, in the positive sense, despite the fact that God asked some kind of crazy things from him, just like Noah, who had to build the ark, trusting God was going to take care of him, and that this storm was coming, even though it may have seemed very ridiculous at times. Abraham, from the get go, trusts God in moving to another place that will, he dreams will someday become his home, and he trusts that God can, in fact, give him descendants and work through him. On the other hand, we see a deeply fearful, kind of flawed person. We see him kind of willing to try and force God's hand in some ways. And so we see these weird, deceptive stories where he multiple times lets someone else kind of take his wife, or pretends that his wife is just his sister, because he's afraid they're going to kill him for his wife. I don't think, as far as I can tell reading these stories, that this is a real threat. This is something that lives in his mind. And he chooses this kind of bizarre cunning to try and protect himself. We also see kind of that tendency again in the heartbreaking story with Sarah's maidservant named Hagar, in which it feels like God is moving a little too slow, and so they adopt this cultural practice where Hagar becomes a concubine, kind of a second wife, but not with the same status. And she does manage to get pregnant by Abraham. And this leads, unsurprisingly, to a lot of conflict in the family, both with Hagar kind of being disdainful of her mistress, and then of Sarah being jealous and very vicious about it, and Abraham not really standing between them. And so that Hagar is eventually banished for nothing besides the fact that she's being used by her master and her mistress. And yet God intervenes and protects her, takes care of her in the wilderness, and we're kind of told that despite these very gross flaws in these people, God is willing to continue working with them and to protect those that are hurt by them in some small way. So we get to the chapter we're in right now, chapter 17, which is kind of the culmination of these stories, with Abraham and Sarah proving to be something of a mixed bag. They're not quite the heroes we always seem to be looking for in the faith, because I'm not sure such people actually exist. So I'm going to read kind of a bigger section to get us through. So I'm going to read Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 19. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk with me and be trustworthy. I will make a covenant between us, and I will give you many, many descendants. Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, But me, my covenant's with you. You will be the ancestor of many nations. And because I have made you the ancestor of many nations, your name will no longer be Abram, but Abraham. I will make you very fertile. I will produce nations from you, and kings will come from you. I will set up my covenant with you and your descendants after you in every generation as an enduring covenant. I will be your God and your descendants' God after you. I will give you and your descendants the land in which you are immigrants, the whole land of Canaan as an enduring possession. I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants in every generation. This is my covenant that you and your descendants must keep. Circumcise every male. You must circumcise the flesh of your foreskins. It will be a symbol of the covenant between us. On the 8th day after birth, every male in every generation must be circumcised, including those who are not your children, those born in your household, and those purchased with silver from foreigners. Be sure you circumcise those born in your household and those purchased with silver. Your flesh will embody my covenant as an enduring covenant. Any uncircumcised male whose flesh and his foreskin remains uncircumcised will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. God said to Abraham, As for your wife Sarah, she will no longer be called Sarah with an I. Her name will now be Sarah with an H. I will bless her and give you a son from her. I will bless her so that she will become nations, and kings of peoples will come from her. Abraham fell on his face and laughed. He said to himself, Can a 100-year-old man become a father, or a 99-year-old woman have a child? To God, Abraham said, If only you would accept Ishmael. But God said, No, your wife Sarah will give birth to a son for you, and you will name him Isaac. I will set up my covenant with him and with his descendants after him, an enduring covenant. So this is the culmination, and it's also kind of one link in the chain of these covenants. So first, God has a couple different covenants that he is making with Abraham about, again, focusing on the land, and then with kind of an offhanded mention of descendants. But this one has kind of an offhanded mention of the land itself, but the descendants are kind of the main promise, as is the kind of change in the relationship between them. It's also been noted that the language God uses here, he's pointing out that the covenants are not just business contracts between people, that they are links that kind of work together. That language of be fruitful showed up both with Adam, the very first human being, as well again with Noah. The idea of be fruitful, multiply, increase, be happy, be fruitful is the very first of the covenants. It's the very first anticipation of what God wanted from humanity. And then we get a nod as well that it says a couple times in there, kings will come from you. And a lot of people think that this was a trick done by the editors, pointing out this vague promise that kings are going to come from you is a reference to kind of the next big covenant, and that's the covenant with David, in which will eventually culminate the Messiah Christ, in whom we are talking about his crucifixion, right, during Lent. I think one of the other really important things about kind of these covenants is this is the first covenant, unlike the last one where only God was limiting himself, that there is a response. Abraham has a very specific response of, I need you to trust me, but when you trust me, you're going to show this in a specific way. And in doing so, I think circumcision hits men kind of where it counts, right? Not just physically in their sexual organs, but it's painful. And over the long term, it will be a physical embodiment, a new identity in which we are people who do this, but not these things. It's a precursor of the law. It's a precursor of God's people setting themselves apart in some special way. And we don't get it from this covenant, but from some of the other conversations Abraham and God have that says, I'm setting you apart, not because you're better. We most certainly don't see that in Abraham's life or in really any of his descendants. I'm setting you apart because I want you to be a bridge between me, God, and the rest of humanity. At one point, they're called a nation of priests, right? Of bridges, of people that will stand in the gap between the rest of humanity and God Himself. And so, this is a very important covenant because it does humble Abraham. It does change his identity and the identity of the people to come. But we also see, as kind of a sign of this, the changing of names, right? Both Abram becomes Abraham, which is a slight variation of his name originally meant father, and then becomes to father of many or father of the nations. And then Sarah's name is a variation on princess originally. It's kind of, like one of the cute spellings we use nowadays. And yet God, I think, particularly emphasizing kind of that royalty, which will culminate later in David. She isn't just a variation on princess. She isn't just kind of a cute, almost there. She becomes just the word itself. She becomes the princess, the queen, the mother in some ways of all those who are to come. And then, just as God has limited Himself in the last few covenants, and God is giving them a new identity, God reveals a new name for Himself. El Shaddai, or God Almighty is one kind of famous translation, or God of the mountain, a God who is a foundation. And this is a really important thing because the other piece of this covenant keeps going back into this new sign, this new identity is one not just for you, but for all your children to come. And Abraham laughs, right? Again, showing himself as a great father of faith here. He doesn't really believe, and we see an important thing in this story that he is willing to kind of compromise. I think in this story, one of the important things to recognize is everybody seems content with kind of the status quo, even if it is kind of broken. Maybe Sarah's just more resigned. I'm not going to get to have a baby. This promise is going to have to be some other way. And we saw already the just immense pain that came when Abraham and Sarah tried to force this promise from God to come true, even though the circumstances weren't there. And yet God says, no, that's not the way I'm going to do things. And I think an important part of this is the timing, right? God could have done something to make this miracle happen somewhere in there, but for some reason, we learn later in this story that Ishmael at this point is 13. It's been 13, 14 years since God mentioned this promise. We have to give Abram and Sarah a little grace for thinking, God, you're moving a little bit slow, right? And yet this kind of contentedness, this resignation to not having their own child together, to God not coming through, to I guess this will have to be good enough, is one that God rejects. His dreams for this couple, his dreams for us so much of the time are grander. We are cynical. We are resigned to, oh well, I guess that's just the way things are going to be. And God is saying otherwise. But the timing is a real obstacle. It really does show a sense of faith is necessary. And so it just struck me as a very appropriate story for us to look at, because at this point they have not met the baby whose name will be laughter, who will kind of unify this theme of transforming kind of cynical laughter into that of wonder. Like, look what God has done. He says, I'm El Shaddai. I'm God Almighty. I can do this thing, but I haven't yet. The timing isn't there. It isn't what you think it is yet. And so I think for us, looking at this story, recognizing that God's timing is often not our timing, and yet God desires good things for us. God is working to bless the entire world, even through deeply flawed people like us. I think it's a beautiful story for us to look at during Lent, in when it often does feel like we're waiting. We're not seeing the promises fulfilled. We don't get what God is up to, right? And so I think there's a question for us is, in what are the places in which our heart is waiting and yearning right now? And we might feel frustrated or disappointed with God. What are the places that we've maybe tried to force it? Maybe we have hurt ourselves, we have hurt others by our willingness to take things into our own hands, try to force things to match our will on it? What are the places we're growing cynical? Maybe we've even stopped hoping that God would come through, or another person would come through, or the world could be different than it is. Because just as this kind of compromise version in which Ishmael becomes the promised child, right? That's not what God's plan was. And it is a compromise, it is an alternate. It isn't what God desired. And maybe they're accepting it out of cynicism or a loss of hope because it seemed the most that they could hope for. Do we have things like that in our lives? Is there cynicism sneaking about the way God is working or the timing of God's work? Are there places when we can trust God to maybe take some of that cynicism and turn it into wonder? Take one kind of laughter and turn it into another. And again, when we are working on these things with God, we need to be careful because at the end of this story, Abraham has a new name. He has a new identity, one that is going to cost him where it hurts, right? Are we willing to trust that for those dreams, to not let the ache and the cynicism define us? Are we willing to trust over the long term that God does in fact know what he's doing? Are we willing to listen to what I think is the Lenten call of God? Trust my promises and my ways, even my timing, because I'm God Almighty. I'm not going to do things the way you expect. I'm not going to do things the way maybe even you're willing to accept. Are you going to trust me?